The 2020 Megatins saw the debut of Red-Eyes Dark Dragoon. This is a card that everyone is trying to put in their deck currently, whether it's by using Verde Anaconda, Red-Eyes Insight with Red-Eyes Fusion, or the Money Mud Dragon combo. There's a lot of different really unique ways to get this card out, and because it's so generic, and it's an Omni-Negate, everyone is trying to find their own way to use it. Now, you probably already know what Dragoon does, especially if you've played any time in the last 2 weeks, but what can be done about it? How can we counter Dragoon, get it off the field, and win the game despite it? Well, it turns out there's many ways to do this. Some are a lot better than others, but a lot of them have their own downsides that have to be considered. Before we get into my list of counters, let's first go over what Dragoon does. Red-Eyes Dark Dragoon is a level 8 Dark Fusion spellcaster monster. It has 3000 attack and 2500 defense. It takes Dark Magician, plus Red-Eyes Black Dragon or 1 Dragon Effect monster, and it reads, cannot be destroyed by card effects. Neither player can target this card with card effects. During your main phase, you can destroy 1 monster your opponent controls, and if you do, inflict damage to your opponent equal to that monster's original attack. You can only use this effect a number of times per turn, up to the number of normal monsters used as fusion material for this card. Once per turn, when a card or effect is activated, quick effect, you can discard 1 card, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that card. And if you do that, this card gains 1000 attack permanently. In essence, this card is very similar to a card like Thunder Dragon Colossus that requires you to play some kind of main deck out to it. Back when Colossus was at 3, it was a really difficult card for rogue decks to get over, and Dragoon is no different. In a way, Dragoon's ability to pop monsters when you go second is one of its best features, because it makes it so that this card is really good going first or second. It having the ability to deal burn damage and gain attack, of course, is very fitting considering this is supposed to be an anime-type boss monster. So, what can counter Dragoon? Essentially, we need a card that doesn't destroy and doesn't target. As well, because Dragoon has an Omni-Negate, we have to be able to bait that out. Notably, Dragoon does not have battle protection, but it does have an ability to gain attack, which means killing it in combat will be pretty difficult. This makes it really difficult to out, but there are a lot of ways to do it. With that out of the way, what cards out Dragoon? To start off the list, we'll be going over Dark Ruler No More and Forbidden Droplet. These are by far the most common board breakers that you'll see in just about every deck. Each one has their own downside, but they are effective against most decks. Namely, for Dark Ruler No More, you can't do damage during the turn you activate it. And for Forbidden Droplet, you usually have to pitch or send a lot of cards in order to get enough negates so that you can actually break the board. Dark Ruler No More is usually better in decks that have a harder time OTKing. Use it to break their board and then build your own. Whereas Droplet synergizes with decks that want cards in the graveyard. Striker with Area 0, Thunder Dragon cards, Eldritch, anything like that. Another upside of Droplet is that it can be used going first as well, which is really where it shines, honestly. You build your board and then you can send cards that you drew off of your combo to activate Droplet in order to negate their monsters, and they can't respond to it. Another upside to both of these cards is that you can draw them for turn, which is especially relevant when cards like Trishula and decks like Infernoble are in the format. Moving on, we have Super Polymerization. There are tons of great targets for Super Poly, and you can't respond to it. Most notably, Predaplant Dragostapelia and Trifio Veridum, as well as Starving Venom, of course. This card is excellent because they usually end with Verde Anaconda, which is also a dark attribute monster, but the main downside to it is that it takes a lot of extra deck space or side deck space, and it's not effective against every single deck. As a bit of a pro tip though, there are some lesser known targets for Super Polymerization against other decks, such as Draco Equus for Infernobles. The only other downside to Super Poly is that you have to discard a card, but in my opinion this isn't really a downside, whereas with Forbidden Droplet, you would need to discard many cards to have the same spell speed 4 effect that Super Poly has. Moving on, a much lesser known card, Herald of the Abyss. Definitely an underused out to cards like Dragoon, mostly because it's not as much of a blowout, it's only a 1-for-1. The main upside compared to all the previous cards, though, is that it doesn't restrict your damage, doesn't restrict your extra deck space, and doesn't have a large cost. It can be negated, but it will basically always 1-for-1, and it being an activate once per turn means that if you negate its activation, you can activate another one. In my opinion, this is a very interesting card that might find its place in certain rogue side decks, mostly because it doesn't have the downsides of the previous cards. Next up on the list, we have hand traps, such as Effect Veiler, Infinite Impermanence, and Cyframe Gear Gamma. Now there are plenty more cards like this, but the idea isn't to use it on Dragoon, because you can't, is you hand trap the Verde Anaconda when it's activating its effect. This will still have them send the Red-Eyes Fusion as cost, so it'll no longer be in their deck, and now they'll have just 2 bricks in their deck. Of course, the main upside to hand traps is how generic they are. They're always solid cards going first or second, which honestly makes these some of the best ways to prevent Dragoon from ever hitting the field. It's also worth noting that if they're playing the build with Red-Eyes Insight that has Secret Village in it, all of these get around that and prevent them from summoning Dragoon with Secret Village face up on the field. Doubly so for Effect Veiler, because it is a spellcaster monster, and you can normal summon it to out the Secret Village, if say you drew it for turn alongside one of the other outs. Next up, we have Kaijus. Similar to the previous cards, Kaijus can also get around Secret Village, and the main upside to them is that any problem can be solved with a Kaiju. Very few cards in the game are immune to tributing, and Kaijus come in a lot of different levels and attributes, which can help them synergize with certain decks. Of course, the huge downside to Kaijus is that they do nothing going first, and they give your opponent a body, which is why most people usually opt for Gameciel over the rest, even though in theory, Gameciel has the strongest effect, and is level 8, but those things don't come up very often. It's also worth noting that Kaijus can out barrier statues. If there's a specific barrier statue that your deck is weak to, whether it's because of Gizmek Uka, or if it's because of the Simorgh Link 3 summoning the Wind Barrier statue, you can play the right Kaiju to be able to tribute over it. Next up, we have Trishula, a really powerful card first or second. With so many decks playing Auroradon, this card is extremely easy to make. With a massive 2700 body, and it happens to be level 9, which means it can be used for calamities. The important thing here is that none of Trishula's effects target. Similarly, you could use a card like Ice Dragon's Prison to accomplish basically the same thing. Since they'll always have Dark Magician in their graveyard, unless they somehow ended with Herald on their field so their materials were banished, you can summon the Dark Magician and then banish both the Dark Magician and the Dragoon, since it doesn't target. Prison is also super versatile, because it can be used just to get a body on the field, and is pretty insane in mirror matches. Another thing worth noting is that both of these cards are really good against Eldritch, since after they have both Golden Lords out, you can use either of these cards to banish both of them. Moving on, we have Zoo King Alpha, which is a card we don't have yet, but is coming out in Phantom Rage. If you don't know what this card does, it's essentially reusable removal on a massive 3000 attack body. It has tons of synergy with Beast, Beast Warrior, or Winged Beast decks, and it basically forces Dragoon to negate it, without you having to commit. Since this card doesn't target like Pankratops, and will have 3 copies of it instead of 1, I expect this card to be everywhere. Currently, it's being played a lot in the OCG, which is worth mentioning. Finally, I wanted to mention some generic Link monsters that can help you get rid of Dragoon. It doesn't get much more generic than Links, honestly, since you don't have to draw them, they're just in your extra deck, and any monsters can be made into Link. First off, we have Borreload Dragon, by far the most generic. This is a Link 4 that outs pretty much everything. You can steal Dragoon, and then it lets you go into main phase 2 to pop 2 cards and burn as well. Then on your opponent's turn, you can use Dragoon's effect to negate, which is pretty nice. After that, we have Ningirsu. This Link 3 monster is a lot better for climbing into Accesscode Talker, and it can out Dragoon before the battle phase. Definitely better in certain decks that actually want to send cards to graveyard, or have extra cards that can be sent. Most decks, when they're actually pushing for game, usually have a couple extra bodies, which can make Ningirsu way easier to summon. And finally, we have one of my favorite cards in the entire game, Avermax. What better way to out a Towers monster than with another Towers? This card has some really insane interactions with Dragoon that I'll go over right now. First off, you can out Dragoon in battle using its attack boost effect. However, Dragoon can negate it. If they do negate it though, Avermax's 4th effect will activate, which will shuffle a card on the field without targeting, which means Avermax has 2 different ways to out Dragoon. If you make Avermax with IP Masquerena, then he won't get destroyed by Dragoon's negate, but will still die in battle, and will still get to shuffle it away. If you manage to get Avermax onto the field before they ever use a Dragoon negate, meaning Dragoon will still be at 3000 attack, you can choose to not activate Avermax's effect, forcing both Dragoon and Avermax to crash, and then shuffle an extra card away, which lets it 2 for 1 instead of 1 for 1. And of course, if you can bait the negate before making Avermax, then Avermax is an insane card to out Dragoon, because not only will it out Dragoon, it'll deal 3000 damage no matter what, be a pain to get rid of, redirect attacks away from your other monsters, and when they do get rid of it, it'll shuffle a card on the field into the deck without having to target. This card is especially noteworthy because most of the decks that Dragoon is being played in are actually control deck, and Avermax has always been known to be a really hard card for control decks to get rid of. Dragoon is one hell of a card, but there's definitely plenty of generic and strong ways to out it. Even though it's appearing everywhere, I wouldn't go as far to call it meta-defining, at least not in the same way that Colossus was, mostly because we have way more outs to this card than we did before. I hope this list was useful to anyone watching, and feel free to comment your favorite out to Dragoon in the comments below, no matter how obscure or specific. That's it for my list of cards, and thank you for watching.